Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give us about 30 more seconds before we start to have everyone come in. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program, What History Teaches, Universities, Education, and the Role of Intellectuals. My name is Lauren Karras, and I have the honor of serving as the Chief Learning Officer at the Nancy and David Wolfe Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. Our museum is located in Cincinnati's historic Union Terminal, a train station where thousands of Holocaust survivors arrived after the war to rebuild their lives right here in Cincinnati. Our organization carries their legacies forward through innovative programming like today's event, which asks us to learn from the past in order to better understand our present. Before we begin, I just want to thank our partners at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center for coordinating the logistics of this program series. And I also want to thank the Holocaust museums and centers across the country who have joined us to bring this vital content to a broad audience. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sarah Crane. Dr. Crane is visiting assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Cincinnati, and she is also our center's scholar in residence. Dr. Crane is going to introduce today's program and our speaker, Dr. Steven Remy. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Lauren. Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you all today our speaker, Dr. Steven Remy, who is a professor of history at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and the Graduate Center, where he has taught modern German and European history since 2002. He is an award-winning teacher and currently the chair of the Brooklyn College History Department. His published works include The Heidelberg Myth, The Nazification and Denazification of a German University, The Malmedy Massacre, The War Crimes Trial Controversy, Adolf Hitler, A Reference Guide to His Life and Work, and War Crimes, Law, Politics, and Armed Conflict in the Modern World. He has appeared as a commentator on numerous television series, documentaries, films, podcasts, and now our webinar today. He is a very gifted speaker and historian not only of Nazi Germany, but of our ability to make sense of this history moving forward. So thank you. Thank you, Steven.
Let's say I should unmute myself. I didn't unmute myself. Let me start over again. Thank you, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to thank Sarah, Haley, and their colleagues for the invitation, for making the arrangements. Let me start my timer here. If I may, I would like to dedicate my remarks to the memory of Anson Robbenbach. Andy was a distinguished historian of modern Europe, especially Germany, at Princeton University. His work greatly expanded our understanding of National Socialism and, more generally, the intellectual and cultural dimensions of fascism. He was also a mentor to many scholars, and I'm privileged to count myself among them. His support made the publication of my first book, The Heidelberg Myth, possible, and his guidance played a crucial role in launching my career. I miss him very much. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, that country was home to the world's greatest universities and scientific institutions. And in this talk, I'll explain what happened next. Now, I'll share my screen here and show you some slides. And we'll begin here with Victor Klemperer. In August 1936, Victor Klemperer, who was a German-Jewish professor of Romance languages at the Technical University in Dresden, wrote the following in his diary. If one day the situation were reversed and the fate of the vanquished lay in my hands, then I would let all the ordinary folk go and even some of the leaders. But I would have all the intellectuals strung up and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from the lampposts for as long as was compatible with hygiene. Now, like other Jewish scholars since 1933, Klemperer had been subjected to an escalating series of professional restrictions and petty humiliations until he was finally forced to retire in 1935. His anger was not just directed at Hitler and the regime. All around him, he saw conformity, complicity, and cowardice. He understood then what historians would confirm only decades later. The Nazification of Germany's universities was in part imposed from outside the ivory tower and in part generated from within. Above all, he knew that Germany's professoriate was deeply complicit in the consolidation of the regime's power. Now, what Klemperer had witnessed at Dresden had taken place at every one of Germany's 22 universities, but it took historians a long time to delve deeply into the complicity of the professors. Well, why was this? A major reason is the influence of a myth, first articulated by non-Jewish German academics in 1945. By myth, I mean a story about the past, a story that combines elements of truth and falsehood and is perpetuated to make an authoritative claim on knowledge and power. Now, in 1945, the Freiburg historian Gerhard Ritter published an article in an influential German journal titled simply "The Professor in the Third Reich." Ritter's intended audience was not just fellow Germans, but American and British readers, and his essay was republished a year later in the Journal Review of Politics. In Ritter's version of events, in 1933, the universities were taken over by a small clique of ideologues and pseudo-scholars who were joined briefly by a few well-established academics like the philosopher Martin Heidegger. The result was that Germany's once great universities were plunged into a new dark ages. But Ritter asserted that the vast majority of professors wanted nothing to do with the Nazi regime, its ideology, and its policies. He claimed that most defended the autonomy of scholarship against political interference. The majority, who had not been purged by the Nazis, rejected National Socialism and struggled to go about their work as before. Now, if some had joined the party or one of its affiliated organizations, well, they had done so out of initial misplaced enthusiasm or to protect their careers. But according to Ritter, most were quickly disillusioned, and in any case, they were marginalized by the regime. Now, from the vantage point of 1945, the implications for the future of the universities should be clear. If most scholars maintained their integrity, that meant that the universities had little need for a purge of the faculty beyond the relatively few ideological fanatics. This meant that they were well positioned to resume their disrupted work. Now, Victor Klemperer and other persecuted Jewish scholars had seen through this lie from the start. While Klemperer was powerless to do anything about it in 1936, it was a different story after 1945. In 1946, the Latvian-born scholar of Yiddish, Max Weinreich, published a remarkable book, and remarkably little-known book, Hitler's Professors. His book is very much worth reading today. Now, Weinreich drew on documents and publications of professors, and he concluded that the Holocaust, and I'm quoting him here, was not perpetrated solely by a comparative small gang of the elite guard or by the Gestapo. The actual murderers and those who sent them out and applauded them had accomplices. German scholarship provided the ideas and techniques which led to and justified this unparalleled slaughter. Now, Weinreich's indictment should have been the starting point for a more in-depth investigation of the professoriate of individual disciplines and institutions by scholars who had access to far more sources than he did. But it was not to be. Instead, it was Gerhard Ritter's characterization of an ivory tower under siege that remained the most influential. And it would not be until the 1990s before historians really began to investigate the records of prominent individual scholars and scientists, disciplines like law, history, and medicine, and entire universities. And I was one of them. And soon a consensus emerged that confirmed Weinreich's early unsparing assessment. Germany's universities and its scientific institutions played a crucial role in the establishment and maintenance of the Nazi regime and its war of genocidal territorial expansion. Now, I had decided to investigate Germany's oldest university, Heidelberg, during and after the years of Nazi rule. And when I researched the university's archives and those of the state education ministry, the records of the American occupation, and not least, the publications of university professors themselves, four things became clear. First, most professors welcomed the new regime in 1933 and responded to the purges of their Jewish colleagues with near total silence. Now, to begin with, Adolf Hitler detested intellectuals, and Nazi party officials believed that they had good reason to distrust university professors. Though on the whole, professors were politically conservative, only about a dozen had joined the Nazi party before 1933. But the regime's distrust turned out to be unjustified. The dominant response of professors who had not been fired was strong enthusiasm for the regime and a demonstrated willingness to serve it. As for their silence, as hundreds of their Jewish colleagues were fired, I found this telling assessment in the then unpublished memoirs of the Heidelberg botanist Gerta von Ubisch. Gerta von Ubisch was the first woman in the state of Baden to complete a dissertation and receive state permission to teach at a university. She was fired in 1935 on racial grounds, so-called racial grounds. And she wrote this: "One asks oneself, how is it possible that the universities did not speak out against this law, that they did not unanimously speak up for their colleagues? If all university professors, doctors, jurists had done this, if all had gone on strike, this law could have never been carried out. In their heart of hearts, many Germans were anti-Semites, and each one had one or more or less large circle of Jews that he knew well and that he accepted as exceptions, while he rejected the Jews in principle. There were many among the university professors who found that there were too many Jews among the instructors." And I should add that in their embrace of the new regime, universities were typical of every single significant institution and profession in Germany. Second, Germany's university professors put their knowledge, their abilities, and their prestige at the regime's service. The willingness of non-Jewish academics to serve the regime manifested itself both in practical and in symbolic terms. In practical terms, it meant that several thousand scholars and scientists would deploy their expertise in direct support of the regime's institutions and policies as physicians, physicists, anthropologists, historians, demographers, legal and political theorists, sociologists, economists, and so on. It also, of course, meant that they would teach students. Symbolically, this willingness contributed to the regime's legitimacy in Germany and abroad. Now, this is what the regime expected. Nazi party officials demanded that universities must serve the German people, now defined in terms of race. So, what role did the country's academics play in peace and in wartime? The convergence of the regime's expectations and the professors' willingness to meet them was on full public display at Heidelberg in the summer of 1936. That year marked the 550th anniversary of the university's founding, and the regime chose the occasion to host an international celebration of this storied institution and what party ideologues called the German spirit in science. So this spirit was fundamentally opposed to traditions of research and teaching instituted in the Western world, in that it first rejected the possibility of objectivity in scholarship. Second, It declared that the purpose of scholarship was first and foremost to serve the German people. And third, it was opposed to hyper-specialization in scholarly fields, or as one Heidelberg professor put it, a heap of disconnected specialties. At the heart of this conception was race. The individual scholar's race determined how that scholar looked at the world. And as representatives of a so-called inferior race, Jews were incapable of examining the world honestly and accurately. Now, the spectacle that took place over 3 days in late June in 1936 was unique in the experience of German universities in the Third Reich. The celebration included ceremonies, tours, speeches, and the bestowal of honorary degrees on foreign scholars. That included representatives of a number of American universities. So here we have the Dean of Carleton College, Lindsay Thomas Blaney, with the then Heidelberg University rector, or president, chancellor, Wilhelm Groh, at the ceremonies. And you'll notice behind him on the right is a stormtrooper, probably a student, and on the left, in the background is an SS officer and a university professor. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's propaganda minister and a graduate of Heidelberg, gave a speech at a gala event in Heidelberg's great castle, and he noted in his diary that his remarks were met by thunderous applause from the assembled guests, most of the university's faculty among them. But the period from 1936 to 1939 was a transformative one for Heidelberg and other universities. In just 3 years, professors in every discipline embraced the German spirit in scholarship. Now, this is one of Heidelberg's main university buildings, and you'll see this enormous bronze eagle, very much in the style of Nazi-approved artwork over the main entrance. And the dedication of the building is Dem Deutschen Geist, to the German spirit. When the Nazis came to power, the university had the same building had this over the same doorway. The dedication read Dem Lebendigen Geist, which means dedicated to the eternal spirit, with a statue of Athena holding her genius over the doorway. It was replaced in 1933 with this, to the German spirit in scholarship, and with the Nazi eagle. When the Americans occupied Heidelberg in 1945 and the university was reopened, the Athena was returned to her place of honor, former place of honor, and the building rededicated to the living spirit. Now, let me give you just a couple of representative examples from Heidelberg of the so-called German spirit in action. One of them is from the medical faculty. Throughout Germany, a relatively large number of physicians joined the Nazi Party, or they became enthusiastic supporters. Many medical scientists developed and disseminated Nazi race theories in their classrooms, and they were the designers and perpetrators of some of the regime's most heinous crimes, principally medical murder, or so-called euthanasia, and experiments performed on concentration camp and death camp inmates. During the years of Nazi rule, Heidelberg's medical faculty would contain a higher percentage of party members than any other. In 1934, the psychiatrist Karl Schneider became the chair of the medical faculty. Schneider had been a party member since 1932, and he was appointed to this position mainly because of his qualifications as a scientist, and not because he was a Nazi Party member. He had published extensively on psychiatry in the 1920s, and in 1930 he had produced a well-regarded study of schizophrenia. He also became the head of the state of Baden's Racial Policy Office. So this nexus of university-based scientific expertise and state power is a perfect example of the way in which the professoriate served the regime outside the universities. Now, in Heidelberg's medical faculty, the previous director and 3 instructors in the psychiatry clinic had been fired. This allowed Schneider to surround himself with devoted assistants, and a number of them went on to distinguished careers in post-war West and East Germany, unimpeded by their past association with their mentor or with their own complicity in medical crimes. Schneider and other professors published books and articles and delivered lectures on so-called race science. But they did more than that. In line with the regime's hereditary protection law, which required the forced sterilization of men and women deemed by the regime to be mentally or physically disabled, 285 sterilizations were performed at the university's women's clinic in 1934 and 1935. Schneider would go on to become one of the physicians recruited by the regime to plan and advise the program known as Operation T4 of systematically murdering handicapped Germans. He also became one of the program's leading researchers. His objective was to obtain a steady supply of patients to examine and experiment upon before and after they were murdered. He established his clinic at Heidelberg as one of 2 major research centers. With funds from the regime, he expanded his experimental facilities to 2 state hospitals, one of which functioned as a killing center for children. The hospital, in turn, provided Schneider and his colleagues and his students with a steady supply of human subjects and a particular interest to Schneider, their brains. Not surprisingly, the Heidelberg Clinic became an important training center for other T4 specialists. There are many more examples I could cite, and I could refer you to the Heidelberg myth and other works on other German universities. But in the interest of time, I'll move on and just say that the case of Schneider and many other Heidelberg professors, but Schneider in particular, was extreme, but it was not exceptional. Beginning in 1939, when the war started, scholars from all disciplines contributed their prestige and their expertise to the war effort through publications, through lectures, through planning the exploitation and resettlement of conquered territories, through developing weapons and weapons-related technologies, and through medical experiments and mass murder. At the same time, individual or organized resistance by professors and students was rare, and in the case of the professors, it was non-existent. Okay, well, why did so many professors conform so readily and in many cases with such considerable commitment and enthusiasm? First, the Nazi regime's promise to restore Germany to greatness resonated with the conservative nationalist orientation of the vast majority of professors. Most of them despised the liberal democratic Weimar Republic, and they resented the post-World War I settlement. Second, to be sure, there was the coercive effects of fear. This was a dangerous regime. And we're talking about fear not just of what the state might do, but what Nazi students might do. And Nazi students at Germany's universities were well organized. They were very aggressive, and they proved willing to harass and denounce professors they didn't like. Their ideological commitment was energizing to professors, particularly younger junior scholars, but it was also intimidating. Third, the evidence is clear that opportunism and opportunity played a role. In the records of the post-war occupation, I found a telling comment from a Heidelberg chemist named Karl Freudenberg. He told an American official that he hoped the university could retain one thing from the Nazi period, one thing, and that was what he called the copious financial means. So engaging in regime-supported research came with benefits. It came with the opportunity for career advancement. Carl Schneider is a perfect example, but also financial resources. And for some, particularly in the medical faculties, there was the chance to conduct research without legal or ethical restrictions. Okay, so this intersection of opportunism and ideology was of particular significance to a younger generation of scholars. That is, men often from lower middle class backgrounds who had faced a dismal academic job market in the years leading up to 1933, and a dismal job market in general. These men in the university context belong to a cohort that the German historian Michael Wild has characterized as the uncompromising generation. That is, men born between 1900 and 1910, so they were too young to have served in World War I, who became fanatically committed Nazis. They became committed Nazis in part because they had grown up during the deprivations of World War I and the economic and political instability of the post-war Weimar Republic. A small but important number of them attended universities, often earning doctorates in political science or law, and they became active in Nazi student groups in the later years of the 1920s and early 1930s before joining the SS as bureaucrats and in some cases mass murderers. And most of them, most who survived the war, integrated with little disruption or difficulty into West German society. An exemplary among its members, the members of this cohort, is Franz Alfred Six. Six was born in 1909, and he joined the Nazi Party in the Stormtroopers, and he studied sociology and political science at Heidelberg, and where he also became one of the most radical Nazi student leaders. And he earned his doctorate in 1934, and his dissertation was a study of how Nazi newspapers in Heidelberg targeted political enemies in the 1933 elections. And a year later, he joined the SS, and he worked for its elite intelligence unit, the SD, or the Sicherheitsdienst. Six and several other Heidelberg graduates and professors worked together to recruit other scholars into the SD. Now, Six specialized in the identification of real or potential regime opponents. So he combined organizational skills, an academic background, and intense ideological commitment. And this combination was typical of the often highly educated officers that staffed the middle and the upper ranks of the SD. Now, after Six completed the required second dissertation, and this one was on regime propaganda, this second dissertation would grant him the right to teach in a university, and he was appointed as a professor of law at the university in Königsberg, and then as the equivalent of a dean in foreign political affairs in Berlin. He was not yet 30 years old. But he didn't remain behind a desk. He served in a special SS task force conducting abductions and assassinations in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland before, and he was soon preparing to undertake similar work following the expected German occupation of Britain. When that invasion was canceled, Six was charged with confiscating the Jewish public and private library collections in German-occupied Europe. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, he commanded an SS mobile execution squad. So he was an intellectual, a bureaucrat, and he was a mass murderer. Fourth, when the war ended, professors articulated the myth of opposition to the regime that I described earlier. When they were faced with unwanted denazification investigations into their backgrounds, they closed ranks around a story of persecution and resistance. Now, in one very important way, Heidelberg was not typical of Germany's universities in 1945, and that's because it was captured by American forces intact, without a significant fight, and it was almost entirely undamaged. This is very significant. It's very significant because it meant that the university, particularly its medical school, could be reopened quickly. And that's something that American officials very much wanted to see happen. But you can probably see where this is going, right? That the faculty and the staff and the student body had to be investigated before the institution could reopen. And the initial investigation carried out by the Americans in the summer of 1945 was rushed. And it was superficial. but it did mean that the medical school could resume instruction in August, making Heidelberg the first of Germany's universities to reopen its lecture halls and its laboratories. And the entire university reopened in January 1946. Now, it was not until a German Jewish U.S. Army counterintelligence officer, Daniel Penham, arrived in Heidelberg and conducted a far more thorough follow-up investigation in the fall and spring, and produced a much more accurate picture of the faculty's relationship to the regime. And I had the great pleasure and privilege of speaking to Daniel Penham when I was doing my research for the dissertation that became the Heidelberg myth. Penham was one of hundreds of German-speaking Jewish refugees who served in the U.S. Army. And many of them were trained as wartime interrogators of prisoners of war and suspected war criminals. And many would go on to serve in the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, or the CIC. And Daniel Penham was a CIC special agent. And as CIC agents, they played a very important role in denazification and also in war crimes investigations. Now, in early 1946, Penham submitted a damning assessment of Heidelberg's faculty and the failure of the Americans to have conducted a more thorough purge. This is his, I'm quoting from one of the most important parts of his assessment. In this agent's opinion, a tremendous mistake was made in opening Heidelberg University at the time it was done. Hardly had the last echoes of gunfire died away in the distance when, with a hurry and flurry, completely unjustified by the situation at the time, the doors of the medical school were thrown open, without consideration for the fact that Heidelberg University, as well as all of the German universities, had been, over a period of 12 years, nazified to the core. And now, over 20 years of research in Germany, in Israel, in the United States, we know that Daniel Penham was absolutely correct, as was Max Weinreich. Now, Penham demanded that the university be closed for security reasons. But that demand was ignored by American officials, and soon denazification, which was deeply unpopular among Germans, was abandoned in favor of rapid reconstruction and the reintegration of former Nazis into the new peacetime Germany. Now, what did this short-circuited denazification of Germany's universities mean for the post-war period? Well, first, it meant that hundreds of Jewish scholars who had been purged by the regime were never invited to return. Second, it meant that hundreds of scholars and scientists who had served the regime continued to teach and conduct research in and outside Germany. Now, we still have a great deal to learn about the longer-term significance of this fact. Now, to be sure, overt forms and expressions of National Socialism and Nazi racism had been discredited. Overt forms. The most ideologically committed Nazi professors were either purged for good, or they retired, or they committed suicide in 1945 or 1946. Carl Schneider was one of them. But the majority remained, often for decades more, and historians are still trying to trace the connections between their experiences between 1933 and 1945 and their post-war careers. I can go back to the example of Franz Alfred Six. His post-war career is instructive in some ways. He was actually sentenced to 20 years imprisonment by the Nuremberg Military Tribunal for his involvement as an SS officer and his involvement in the mobile execution squads and operating in Russia. He was released in 1952, and with the help of former SS comrades, he resumed his work in journalism as an editor for the popular magazine Der Spiegel. Der Spiegel was the West German equivalent of Time magazine. And he then became an advertising executive for Porsche, and Porsche in the 1950s was a kind of way station for ex-Nazis who were reintegrating into or integrating themselves into West Germany's booming private sector. But Six's career trajectory was typical of hundreds of thousands of former Nazis, including SS officers. And let me give you another example. This one is little known even within Germany, and that is of Reinhard Hearn. I don't suspect anybody here has heard of Reinhard Hearn. Hearn entered far-right activism in the early 1920s, and he studied law and economics, and he joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1933. He completed his second thesis in law at Heidelberg in 1934, and there he became something of a mentor to Nazi students, like Franz Alfred Six. He also became an influential bureaucrat / intellectual in the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS, and there he specialized in studying the relationship between the German people as a so-called racially defined community and the organizational spaces of the modern state and the military, the bureaucracies, the administrations of the military, of businesses and universities. Now, in the early 1950s, with the help of his extensive network of ex-SS officers, he established what would become the largest private management training academy in Germany. Now, what Hearn did is that he imported to his academy what you might call Nazi management practices. And the basic idea was this. Responsibility was to be delegated by managers to subordinates who would, in the original Nazi conception, rely on their supposed natural and superior Germanic instincts to take initiatives and to innovate without having to be micromanaged. Now, in the post-war context, as you can imagine, Hearn stripped his basic approach, his basic management philosophy of this racial Germanic mysticism that he had bought into and supported during the Nazi period. But his model of management was enormously influential. It made him the West German equivalent of the American management guru Peter Drucker. Ultimately, more than 600,000 German executives representing 2,600 companies were trained at his management school in Lower Saxony. And numerous ex-SS officers taught at the academy. Guess what? One of them was Hearn's former protege, Franz Alfred Six. Okay, well, looking back, what I find really most remarkable is, first of all, the speed and the intensity with which professors in all fields got on board with the Nazi regime without significant protest or resistance. And second, I am struck by the fact that the attempt by the Nazi regime to remake the human landscape of Germany and Europe was to a very significant extent a massive bureaucratic enterprise, one that required a high level of expertise, not just in the hard sciences, but in the humanities and the social sciences. Scholars did not play a supporting role here, but they played a central one. And Max Weinreich, again, had it right in 1946. German scholarship provided the ideas and the techniques which led to and justified this unparalleled slaughter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven. That was a very important, fascinating, and engaging presentation. I want to give us plenty of time for questions, so I will dive right in. And if any of you audience members have a question you would like to pose, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I would like to begin with a question from Bruce on the relationship between professors and students in German universities in the 1930s. Bruce says that my father was a German Jewish young adult in the 1930s. And Germany said that the Nazi movement was indeed enormously popular among university students. Can we understand this more as students being influenced by their professors or professors being strongly influenced by these students? How do you recommend we try to understand the dynamics of this relationship?
That's a great question. I see this as an intensifying symbiotic relationship. And the point about the recollection about the popularity of the Nazis and the stormtroopers among German university students is a really important one. And there was a national organization, as there was for so many different areas of German life, for German university students. And the National German University Student Organization was the first independent organization of its kind in all of Germany to freely elect Nazis to its leadership. I think that says a lot to a part of your question. And then when we look at student activity at different universities, Heidelberg again is exemplary and a very good example. We see an enormous amount of energy, and I think this energy comes not just from being young and committed and idealistic. It also comes from years of a release in 1933 of years of pent-up frustration. Despite the success and the rapid growth and influence of Nazi students individually and organizationally at German universities, despite their successes, there was a great deal of pent-up frustration and resentment that explodes in universities in early 1933, and you see it manifested in a number of ways: violence against Jewish students, attacks, insults, brawling in Kneiper bars in cities and university towns like Heidelberg. This was not anything new in 1933, for sure, but it intensified right around the lead up to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor and the months after he was appointed Chancellor. Professors that the students didn't like were harassed in various ways, in some cases hounded out of the university, whether they were Jewish or not. Most of professors who were fired in the purges were Jewish. Liberal, very liberal, outspoken liberal, let alone left-wing professors were rarities in German universities going into 1933. That aggression, that energy, I keep going back to this formulation of this energy and aggression as being both inspiring, particularly to younger professors, but also very intimidating. And so I see it as a very much of a symbiosis. And then the last thing I'll say very quickly on this account, and Heidelberg is not just exemplary here, but I think in some ways unique. The ranks of younger graduate students, younger academics who are involved in Nazi student activities. This is really a training ground for and an important stage in their radicalization that they would carry once they left the university. And again, Franz Alfred Six and many of his former classmates who went into the SS are perfect examples of this.
Thank you. And responding to a couple of different questions we've received, if we're to understand this kind of symbiosis and this escalation, is there any room to kind of acknowledge perhaps differences that did exist between faculties at the university, perhaps in different disciplines? And was there any kind of room for voicing any form of resistance that we might understand was perhaps silenced or perhaps maybe even fed into this kind of escalating dynamic? How much room is there to acknowledge perhaps the differences that might have existed, but then might have perhaps fallen to the wayside as things escalated?
Yeah, if I understand the question, one of the things that struck me when I was doing my research, well, look, let me put it this way. I went into my research buying into what I called the Heidelberg myth, right? That, well, okay, you read statements like Gerhard Ritter's that, well, look, the ivory tower was put under siege by these ideological fanatics, and yes, there were some of them at the universities, and they played an outside role, and they were a bunch of quacks and pseudo scholars, and we were happy to get rid of them in 1945 with the help of the British, the Americans, Russians, the French. Okay, that made a kind of sense to me going into my research, but then the more research I did, the more I realized that that was complete nonsense. The record, including the publications of professors themselves, simply made it clear that Ritter was not telling the truth. That said, one of the things I noticed too was that ideologically, National Socialism in the realm of academia was a larger tent than people like Ritter and other perpetrators of the myth wanted us to believe. They wanted us to believe that it wasn't a big tent. It was a very small tent, and it just had a handful of ideological fanatics in it. It was actually quite larger than that. So it was possible for professors in different fields to express or hold a range of views, not all of them on the most fanatical ends of the spectrum. Not all university professors were mass murderers like Carl Schneider or Franz Alfred Six. Now, but in terms of resistance, it quickly occurred to me when I started my research that, well, if there had been substantial resistance, individual or collective, at Germany's universities, there would be shelf loads of books and articles about that, celebrating this resistance. But there aren't, because there wasn't. Once we start to get down to a more granular kind of level in terms of what people were really thinking, the kinds of things that they said privately to each other, that I suspect that especially once the war started and things started to become very, very difficult, and then increasingly when it became obvious that Germany was going to lose the war and going to lose it catastrophically, I suspect that there was more discontent among previously enthusiastic professors. But again, as I chart in my book on the 36 to 39 period, and then the chapter on the wartime period, the commitment to supporting the regime and supporting the war effort remains quite substantial, straight into 1945.
Thank you. Responding to another audience question regarding your point that whereas we can consider university faculties as so conservative in the 1930s, but then today, 97% would identify as progressive. How can we understand, especially given current conversations about restriction on expression and what that looks like, how to kind of keep this kind of pluralism in universities? What kind of lesson can we learn about the space that can be created for these kind of pluralistic discussions? And where can we understand the kind of dangers of kind of ideological uniformity? Where can we kind of look for that?
We need to look at ourselves. And what I'm about to say may rankle some of your guests, but I think among the things, probably the single most striking thing that I learned when I was doing research for this book was just how much of the university's Nazification was driven from within its walls. Students played a role, radical students played a role, of course, here too, but the faculty's influence was paramount. And I think looking back as a historian, and being a working academic now, in the situation we find ourselves, there has been a failure on our part to uphold a more open and a more pluralistic approach to debate and dialogue and conversations about all kinds of issues within American colleges and universities. Criticisms leveled by thoughtful conservatives at academia are not baseless. And I say this as somebody who is committed to the mission of a liberal education, and somebody who considers himself to be a liberal, but as an academic, devoted to the mission of a liberal institution. We have to recommit ourselves, in my view, to being much more open about the kinds of work we do, the topics we investigate, the guests we host at our universities, and we have to look very closely and carefully at how we present ourselves to our students, to our colleagues, to within our fields and professions, and to the wider public, to which we are accountable, whether we're in public institutions or in private institutions. So I'm firmly convinced that we have to keep that in mind.
Mm. And I mean, you're an educator. I'm an educator. I know that there are so many educators in this space who confront this kind of question just day to day in the reality of their classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice on just how does one approach just our day-to-day work in such a way that's able to keep account of these kind of broader dynamics, but how does that work on a kind of day-to-day level? How have you experienced that in your work?
Well, if it's not too egotistical, I'll use myself as an example, but you asked me to. So I'm teaching a course, an undergraduate elective this semester on the history of fascism. And I devoted a great deal of thought to, as I like to think I always do, to how I would organize this class, but we're affected by what's going on around us. We can't ignore it. And I decided first and foremost that what I was going to present was going to reflect what I consider to be the best current scholarship on this subject. And there's a lot of scholarship, new scholarship, and very good scholarship now on the fascist tradition in the United States. Going back to the proto-fascist tradition in the 19th century, going into the 20th century and up to the present. So in addition to supporting this, reflecting what I consider to be the best current scholarship, I said on day one to my students, I don't care what your politics are. We're not here as judges. We're not here as editorialists. We're not here as activists. We're here to approach this topic for 75 minutes twice a week as sophisticated students of history. I don't care who you voted for, who you didn't vote for. This is how we're going to approach that. And so far, it's been great. And I'm not trying to give myself credit for all of that. The credit goes to my students. But the idea was to from the start make it clear that we're students. All of us are students of history, and that's how we're going to approach this.
I think that's a remarkable lesson to take forward, and I think a incredible place to kind of end our discussion today. Do you have anything in particular as we kind of move forward as engaged citizens that we need to be looking to universities for as a kind of space to continue to think about these questions? What's kind of the role of universities in continuing to facilitate this kind of critical thinking moving forward?
I think that again, scholars, administrators, students need to take a deep breath and commit and recommit themselves to open dialogue. The cancel culture thing was real. It was real. And it needs to be gone forever. And I think that I think that the public that we serve, that includes, of course, our alumni, need to have this expectation that American colleges and universities have to be safe spaces for open, honest, intellectual exchange, dialogue, and conversations. And it's become increasingly important in my mind, given how much noise and slop and disinformation there is. Well, we're not immune to it, but how much of it there is outside of colleges and universities. And if that sounds too idealistic, well, I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to hold to it.
Well, we very much appreciate you sharing all of that with us today. Thank you. I want to officially thank you, Dr. Steven Remy, for joining us today on this webinar. I want to be very cautious of time, but I see that we're receiving just a lot of thanks for this space that you've created for us today. So thank you. And I wanted to invite everyone to join us on the next webinar in this What History Teaches series. The next one is Between Terror and Resilience, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, hosted by the Holocaust Museum in LA. That will be on November 13th, and we hope to be able to continue this discussion together there. Thank you again, Dr. Remy.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much to the audience. It's easy to reach me. If I didn't get to your question, I'd be happy to correspond with anybody. Thank you.
Thank you.